My sister kept my childhood memories, until one storage unit was opened. I found out my mother had died from a voicemail. Not a phone call I answered. Not a knock on my door. A voicemail, left at 11:42 on a Tuesday morning, while I was standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store trying to decide between the brand my son liked and the one that was $2 cheaper. My sister's voice came through flat and businesslike, the kind of voice you'd use to tell someone their package had shipped. "Hey, it's Denise. Mom passed this morning. Funeral's Friday. I'll handle everything, you don't need to worry about it." That was it. 11 seconds. I know because I replayed it 4 times standing in that aisle, my cart drifting slightly to the left because I'd stopped pushing it. A woman behind me saying "excuse me" twice before I understood she wanted to get past. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I loved my mother. Even after everything, even after all the years of feeling like a guest in my own family, I loved her, and I would have wanted to be there. Not for the funeral logistics. For her. To hold her hand if there was time. To say something even if it was just goodbye. I didn't get that chance because by the time I called Denise back, she told me the arrangements were already made, and there wasn't really anything for me to do. When I asked if I could at least see the body before the service, she paused just long enough for me to feel it and said, "It's a closed casket, Claire. Mom wanted it that way." I found out 3 months later from a cousin who'd attended that it hadn't been a closed casket at all. That was the first lie. It would not be the last, and it would not be the smallest. My name is Claire. I'm 38 years old, I have a 9-year-old son named Milo, and for most of my adult life I have been the daughter who moved away, the daughter who chose her career over family, the daughter who wasn't there enough. That was the story that got told about me at every holiday table I sat at less and less over the years. What never got told, what nobody ever seemed to want to examine too closely, was why I moved away in the first place, and why coming home always felt like walking into a house where the furniture had been quietly rearranged to make sure I never found a comfortable place to sit. Denise is 2 years older than me. Growing up, she was the daughter who never left. She stayed in our hometown, married a man our mother approved of, had 2 kids our mother doted on, and settled into the role of the good daughter so completely that by the time we were adults it was simply understood without anyone saying it out loud that Denise was the one who mattered more. I don't say that out of bitterness. I say it because it's true, and because it matters for what comes later. After the funeral I didn't attend, I drove the 6 hours back to my mother's house anyway, because I needed to see it, needed to stand in the rooms I grew up in and feel whatever there was left to feel. Denise met me at the door with red eyes and a stiffness in her shoulders that I mistook at the time for grief. "You didn't need to come all this way," she said. She was my mother too. Denise didn't answer that. She just stepped aside and let me in, and I remember walking through that house noticing, in the specific way you notice things when your senses are heightened by loss, how many of my mother's belongings were already gone. The curio cabinet in the hallway that used to hold her collection of ceramic birds. Empty. The bookshelf in the den half bare, with pale rectangular ghosts on the wood where framed photos used to sit. "Where's all Mom's stuff?" I asked. "I've been going through things," Denise said. "It's a lot to deal with. I didn't want to leave it all sitting here." At the time, that explanation felt reasonable. Grief makes people do things. Cleaning, organizing, controlling what they can control when everything else feels like it's slipping. I told myself that's what this was. I told myself a lot of things that turned out not to be true. What I specifically asked about that first day back was the boxes. There were 4 boxes in the attic that I knew about because I'd helped my mother pack them myself years earlier, back when she still had the energy to talk about her life in the past tense and mean it fondly instead of finally. Those boxes held things that belonged to me specifically. My childhood drawings, the ones my mother had kept because she said I had a real eye, even when I was 6 and clearly did not have a real eye. My baby book filled out in her handwriting. A shoebox of photographs from a trip we took to the coast when I was 11, the last real vacation before things in our family started to fracture. A cassette tape of me singing at a school recital badly at age 8, that my mother used to play at Thanksgiving to embarrass me in a way that always somehow felt like love. "Those are in storage," Denise told me. "I moved a bunch of stuff to a unit a few towns over. It was getting too crowded here, and the realtor said we needed to declutter before listing the house." "Okay," I said. "Can I get the address? I'd like to go through my boxes." It's not really organized yet, Denise said. Everything's kind of dumped together. I'll sort it eventually and send you what's yours. I want to be honest with you. At that moment I believed her. I had no reason not to. Grief clouds judgment, and I assumed hers was clouded the same way mine was. I flew home 4 days later, back to my own life, my own son, my own job, and I let it go. I let it go for 11 months. The first crack in that trust came on a Sunday afternoon in March, when Milo came into the kitchen holding my phone, which he'd taken off the counter to play a game, and said, "Mom, why does Aunt Denise have a picture of you from when you were little?" I looked at the screen. It was Denise's public Instagram, a photo she'd posted 2 days earlier. A photograph of the two of us as children, standing on a beach, my mother's handwriting visible on the white border where she'd written the date. The exact photograph, or one from the same roll as the ones I remembered from that shoebox in the attic. The caption read, "Missing Mom today. So grateful I have all these memories to hold on to. White heart." I sat with that for a long moment. All these memories to hold on to. I texted her that night. Kept it light because I didn't want to start something over nothing. "Hey, saw your post, that's a sweet photo. Did you end up going through the storage unit? I'd love to grab my boxes whenever it's convenient." She didn't respond for 3 days. When she did, it was one line. "Been super busy with the kids' school stuff, I'll get to it soon, promise." I believed that too, because believing the version of my sister who simply hadn't gotten around to something was easier than believing the alternative. That's something I've learned about myself since all of this happened. I default to generous interpretations of people I love, even when the evidence is quietly stacking up against them, because the alternative means admitting that someone who's supposed to love you back is choosing deliberately again and again to shut you out. The second crack came in July. My mother's estate lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Arthur Kessler who had known our family for almost 20 years, called me out of nowhere on a Thursday evening. I remember exactly where I was standing in my kitchen drying a mixing bowl, because the call felt strange from the first ring. Lawyers don't usually call you just to check in. "Claire," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking because I think you deserve to know the answer, not because I'm trying to cause trouble." "Okay," I said slowly. "Has Denise given you access to your mother's personal storage unit yet? The one on Route 9, the Ashford self-storage facility?" Something in my chest went tight. "No." She said she was still sorting things. "Why?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you the person on the other end is choosing their words carefully because they know what's coming next matters. "Because your mother's will specifically name that unit," Arthur said. "There's a clause. I drafted it myself at your mother's request, about a year and a half before she passed. It states that the contents of storage unit 214 at Ashford Self-Storage are to be divided equally between her 2 daughters, with an inventory to be conducted jointly. It's not something that was left open to interpretation, Claire. Your mother was very specific about it." I set the mixing bowl down on the counter so hard it rattled. "Denise never mentioned a will clause," I said. "She never mentioned probate or an inventory or any of that. She told me Mom's estate was basically nothing to sort through, that most things went to charity, and whatever was left she'd send me eventually." Another pause. "Claire, I sent the will to both of you 18 months ago, right after your mother passed. I have delivery confirmation for both email addresses." I never received that email. I checked that night, going back through every folder, every spam filter, every corner of my inbox. Nothing. Which meant one of 2 things. Either there was a technical error that happened to work out entirely in Denise's favor, or someone had access to my email that I didn't know about, or Denise had simply told Arthur she'd forward it to me and never had. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed running through years of moments that I'd always filed away as ordinary sibling friction, and I started to see a different shape in them. The way Denise always volunteered to handle things, whenever our mother needed help, then somehow never had updates to share. The way our mother's phone number changed once, and I found out about it 4 months late, from a mutual family friend, not from Denise. The way at our mother's 70th birthday, Denise had put together a slideshow of family photos and mine were noticeably, almost surgically, absent, and when I asked about it, she said she must have missed some folders. Small things. Alone, none of them meant anything. Stacked together, they started to look less like carelessness and more like a pattern. I called Arthur back the next morning and asked him to send me a copy of the will directly, along with anything else related to the estate that Denise might not have shared. What he sent me changed the entire shape of what I thought I understood about my family. The will wasn't complicated, but it was specific in a way that told me my mother had thought hard about it. The house sold, proceeds split evenly. A modest retirement account split evenly. And then, singled out in its own clause, storage unit 214, described not as property but almost tenderly, as the personal keepsakes and family history I have preserved, to be shared equally between my daughters, with the hope that they will go through this together. With the hope that they will go through this together. My mother had wanted this. She had wanted us specifically to sit down together and go through our shared history side by side. And Denise had taken that instruction and quietly, patiently, made sure it never happened. I called Denise that afternoon. I tried to keep my voice steady because I still, even then, wanted to give her room to explain herself in a way that made sense. I talked to Arthur, I said. About the storage unit. About the will. There was a long silence on the line. Long enough that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check the call hadn't dropped. I was going to tell you, she finally said. When, Denise? It's been 18 months. It's complicated, she said, and her voice had an edge to it now, defensive in a way I recognized from childhood arguments over who got the front seat, except this wasn't about a front seat anymore. There's stuff in there I haven't even sorted through myself. I didn't want to just dump a bunch of boxes on you before I knew what was even in them. That's not your decision to make alone, I said. The will says jointly. I know what the will says, Claire. I was there when Mom talked to Arthur about it. That stopped me. You were there? You knew about this clause the whole time. Silence again. And in that silence, I understood something I hadn't let myself fully understand until that exact second. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't grief fog or busy mom scheduling chaos. My sister had known for a year and a half exactly what our mother wanted, and had made a conscious, repeated choice to keep me away from it. I need the address of the unit, I said. And I need a key or the code or however it works. I'm not asking anymore. It's not a good time, Denise said. I'm dealing with a lot with the kids right now, Claire. You don't understand what my life is like. I don't care what your life is like right now, I said, and I meant it calmly, the way you mean something after you've stopped being angry and started being clear. I'm going to drive up there next month. If you want to be there when I open it, you're welcome to be there. If not, I'll go alone with Arthur, and we'll do the inventory the way Mom asked for. I hung up before she could answer. I want to pause here and tell you what the month between that phone call and the day I actually stood in front of Unit 214 felt like, because it wasn't dramatic in the way you'd expect. There was no screaming, no dramatic family intervention, no scene at a restaurant with everyone crying into their napkins. It was quieter than that and in some ways lonelier. I went to work. I made Milo's lunches. I sat in his school pickup line and smiled at the other parents, and none of them had any idea that underneath the ordinary surface of my life, I was slowly reconstructing the last decade of my relationship with my sister, and finding that almost everything I'd believed about our closeness had been resting on a foundation she'd built specifically to keep me at a comfortable, manageable distance. I talked to Arthur several more times that month. He was careful, professional, but I could tell he was uncomfortable with what he was seeing too. He mentioned, almost in passing during one call, that Denise had asked him, shortly after our mother's death, whether the storage unit clause was legally binding, or whether it was more of a suggestion. He'd told her it was binding. She hadn't asked again after that. She'd simply stopped bringing it up, and apparently hoped I never would either. I also, in that month, talked to my Aunt Ruth, my mother's younger sister, who I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years, mostly because Denise had always positioned herself as the primary point of contact for extended family and I'd fallen out of the habit of reaching out directly. Ruth, it turned out, had plenty to say. Your mother called me, maybe 2 years before she passed. Ruth told me over the phone, her voice softened by age but still sharp with memory. She was upset. She told me she felt like Denise was trying to write you out of the family slowly, piece by piece. She said Denise kept losing your phone number when people asked for it. She said Denise would tell people you were too busy for family events, when your mother knew for a fact you'd never even been asked. I sat down on my kitchen floor when Ruth told me that. Just sat right down on the tile, my back against the cabinet, and let that sink in. Why didn't Mom ever say anything to me? I asked. Ruth sighed, a long, tired sound. Because your mother was scared of losing Denise's kids. Denise made it clear more than once that if your mother took sides, she'd limit the grandkids' visits. Your mother loved you both, Claire, but she was 70-something years old and terrified of dying without seeing her grandchildren. She chose the path of least resistance. I think she regretted it. I think that clause in the will, the one about the storage unit, was her way of trying to fix it after she was gone, because she couldn't fix it while she was here. I didn't cry when Ruth told me that. I want to be honest about that too, because I think there's a version of this story where I'm supposed to cry right at that moment, and it would make for a better scene, but the truth is I just felt a kind of cold clarity settle over me. My mother had known. She had seen it happening and had been too afraid to stop it directly, and instead had left me a small, quiet instruction, tucked into a legal document, trusting that someday I would find my way to it. I made the 6-hour drive back at the end of that month. Arthur met me at the storage facility, a squat beige building off a 2-lane highway, the kind of place you drive past 100 times without ever really seeing. Denise was there too, standing by her car with her arms crossed, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, which I now understand was less about the weather and more about not wanting me to see her eyes. The three of us walked down the row of units together, the gravel crunching under our feet, nobody saying much of anything. Unit 214 had a simple padlock on it, the kind you buy at any hardware store, nothing special, nothing that suggested what was actually behind it. Arthur held the paperwork. I held my breath, more than I realized until I let it out in a long shaking exhale when Denise finally, wordlessly, produced a key from her purse and unlocked it. The door rolled up with a metallic groan, and there it was. It wasn't what I expected. Part of me, I think, had braced for something dramatic, boxes labeled with my name in bold marker, or some kind of obvious shrine to a daughter being deliberately erased. What was actually there was almost worse in its ordinariness. Stacks of boxes, some labeled in my mother's careful handwriting, some in Denise's Messier scrawl, a few unlabeled entirely. An old rocking chair I remembered from my grandmother's porch, a rolled-up rug, and near the back, half hidden behind a stack of moving blankets, for boxes with faded masking tape labels that I recognized instantly, because I'd written those labels myself at 19 years old, helping my mother pack up my childhood the summer before I left for college. Claire school stuff. Claire photos. Claire miscellaneous. Claire recital tape plus baby book. I walked over and put my hand flat against the top box before I even opened it, just to feel that it was real, that it had actually survived, sitting in the dark for who knows how long while I'd been told repeatedly that everything was still being sorted. These have been here the whole time, I said. It wasn't really a question. Denise didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. I didn't throw anything away, Claire. I want you to know that. I never threw anything of yours away. That's not the same as giving it back to me, I said. Arthur, ever the professional, began the inventory process exactly as the will required, photographing each box, noting contents on a clipboard, keeping his voice neutral and businesslike in a way that I think was intentionally giving both of us room to feel whatever we needed to feel without an audience judging us for it. As he worked, Denise and I stood a few feet apart, not really looking at each other, both of us watching the boxes as if they might do something unexpected. It was in one of the unlabeled boxes, one that Arthur opened about 40 minutes in, that things shifted from painful to something closer to explanatory. Inside was a folder, plain manila, slightly yellowed at the edges, filled with papers that turned out to be copies of old bank statements, several birthday cards, and a stack of letters, some in our mother's handwriting, some typed. Arthur, following the letter of his duty, began sorting them, and it was Denise who suddenly reached out and said, "Wait, those are just old papers. They don't need to be part of the inventory, that's not really. Everything in the unit is part of the inventory, Denise," Arthur said gently but firmly. "That's what the will requires." I picked up one of the letters before Denise could stop me. It was addressed to Denise in our mother's handwriting, dated about 3 years before she died. I remember my hands were slightly unsteady as I unfolded it, some instinct already warning me that this was the moment everything would recontextualize itself. The letter was short. My mother wasn't a woman of many words on paper. It read, in part, something to this effect, that she was setting aside a portion of savings specifically for Denise's children's education, separate from what would eventually be divided between her 2 daughters, Because Denise had asked for help and she wanted to be fair about documenting it so there wouldn't be confusion later. It mentioned an amount. It mentioned that she expected Denise to keep the documentation in case Claire ever asks questions, which even in that raw, aching moment struck me as almost darkly funny, because my mother, even from beyond death, had anticipated this exact scene. But it was the second letter, tucked behind the first, that actually broke something open. This one wasn't from my mother. It was a printed email, forwarded and printed out, dated about 8 months before my mother passed. The sender was Denise. The recipient was our mother. And in it, Denise had written in language far more direct than anything she'd ever said to my face, that she thought it would be easier for everyone if the family focused less on maintaining a relationship with Claire going forward, citing my move out of state as evidence that I had already checked out of the family, and suggesting that when it came to sorting out any future inheritance, it would be simplest if she, Denise, handled the logistics so that things didn't get complicated by long-distance opinions. I read that email twice, then a third time because some part of my brain refused to accept it the first 2 readings. Handled the logistics so that things didn't get complicated by long-distance opinions. I looked up at Denise, who had gone very pale, standing there in the gray light spilling into the storage unit, her arms still crossed but looser now, almost like she was holding herself up rather than holding a boundary. "You told her I checked out," I said quietly. "You told Mom I didn't care." "That's not, I didn't mean it like that," Denise said, but her voice had lost its earlier defensiveness. It sounded, for the first time in this entire ordeal, uncertain. "You wrote it in an email, Denise. There's no like that about it. You wrote that you wanted less focus on maintaining a relationship with me. You wrote that you wanted to handle the logistics, so my opinions wouldn't complicate things." "I was going through a hard time," she said. "James and I were having problems, the kids were struggling in school, and Mom kept asking about you, comparing what you were doing with your career to what I hadn't managed to do with mine, and I just—" She stopped, pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a second. "I just wanted for once for something to be simple. For someone to just trust me to handle something without you swooping in." "I never swooped in," I said. "I wasn't there to swoop in. That was the whole problem. I called Mom every week for years and somehow every time I visited, you'd already told her some version of events where I was too busy, too distant, too checked out to really be part of things. I believed you, Denise. I believed you were being honest with me about how things were between us and Mom." Arthur, to his credit, had quietly stepped back during this exchange, giving us space while still technically continuing his inventory work a respectful distance away, close enough to remain a witness but not so close as to make either of us feel cornered. There was more in that box. There always is, in stories like this, one more thing waiting to complete the picture. A bank statement showed a transfer, made about a year before our mother's death, of a sum of money from our mother's account into an account jointly held by Denise and her husband. $14,000. Not enormous, not life-changing, but not nothing either, and never mentioned to me, not once in any conversation about the estate, despite Denise's repeated insistence that there really wasn't much to split up, and that I shouldn't get my hopes up about anything. "What's this?" I said, holding up the statement. Denise's jaw tightened. "That was a loan. For the kid's orthodontist and some car repairs. I was going to pay it back. Was there paperwork? Anything documenting it as a loan instead of a gift?" She didn't answer that, which was, in its own way, an answer. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, standing in a dusty storage unit with evidence of my sister's dishonesty spread out in front of me like a hand of cards finally revealed. But that's not what it felt like at all. It felt like grief layered on top of older grief, layered on top of a slow, sick recognition that the family I'd spent my whole life trying to stay connected to had, in some very real sense, made a collective decision years earlier, that I was the expendable one, and nobody had ever bothered to tell me directly. I'd had to find it out through bank statements and printed emails in a storage unit off a 2-lane highway. We finished the inventory that day, mostly in silence. Arthur photographed everything, cataloged it, and explained in his calm, lawyerly way, that per the will, all contents needed to be either divided equally by agreed value or sold with proceeds split, and that the boxes explicitly labeled with my name were, obviously, mine outright, no division necessary. Denise didn't argue that point. I think by then, something in her had deflated enough that arguing over my childhood photographs felt beneath even her. I took my 4 boxes home with me that day, packed carefully into the back of my car, buckled in like precious cargo because in every way that mattered to me they were. That night, in a motel room a few hours into my drive home, too raw to keep driving straight through, I opened them one by one. The recital tape was there, a cassette I didn't even have a way to play anymore but kept anyway, running my thumb over my mother's handwriting on the label. Claire, age 8, spring recital. She was so nervous but she did it. 2 exclamation points, the kind of detail that makes grief sharper, somehow more specific, more hers. The baby book was there too, filled with her looping handwriting, notes about my first steps, my first word, which apparently was no, which made me laugh out loud alone in that motel room, a short surprised laugh that turned into something closer to crying by the end of it. And in the photo box, near the bottom, I found something I hadn't expected. A folded piece of paper, unlike the rest, more recent, the paper crisp instead of yellowed. My mother's handwriting again, but shakier. The handwriting of someone in the last stretch of a long illness. It wasn't dated, wasn't addressed to anyone specifically. More like something she'd written for herself and tucked away where she knew, or hoped, it would eventually be found. I won't repeat every word because some things deserve to stay exactly where she left them. But the heart of it was this. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that she had let fear make decisions that love should have made instead. She wrote that she had watched her daughters grow apart and had been too afraid of losing one to fight harder for both, and that if I was reading this, it meant I had finally found my way back to the things that were always meant to be mine, and that she hoped more than anything that finding them meant I'd also found my way back to believing I had always mattered exactly as much as my sister did. I sat on the edge of that motel bed for a long time after reading that. Here's the part of this story where you might expect a dramatic confrontation. A scene where I show up at Denise's house with the letter in hand and finally let years of suppressed anger explode across her front lawn. That's not what happened, and honestly by that point I didn't want it to happen that way. My mother's note had done something unexpected to me. It hadn't just given me evidence of what had been done to me. It had given me permission to stop needing Denise's version of events to feel real in order for mine to matter. What I did instead about 3 weeks later was send Denise an email. Calm, direct, no accusations dressed up as questions. I told her I'd read everything, including the letters, the email she'd sent our mother, the bank statement. I told her I understood, or was trying to understand, that she'd been dealing with her own pressures, her own fears about being enough, and that some of what she'd done had probably come from a place of genuine struggle rather than pure malice. But I told her clearly that understanding where something comes from isn't the same as excusing what it cost someone else, and that what it had cost me was almost 2 decades of believing I was the distant one, the difficult one, the one who didn't try hard enough, when the truth was I had been systematically kept at a distance by someone who benefited from that distance existing. I told her I wasn't interested in a public fight, wasn't going to call other family members and rally them against her, wasn't going to turn our mother's death into a battlefield. But I also told her I wasn't going to pretend the last 2 decades hadn't happened, and that going forward, any relationship we had would need to be built on something more honest than the one we'd had before. She wrote back 4 days later. It wasn't a perfect response. There were still traces of defensiveness in it, still a few sentences where she tried to reframe things in a softer light than they deserved. But there was also, buried in the middle of it, something that read like real acknowledgement. She admitted she'd been jealous of me for years, in ways she'd never let herself examine, jealous of the life I'd built outside the small radius our mother had always operated in, jealous in a way that had curdled slowly into something uglier than jealousy usually is. She admitted the $14,000 had never really been intended as a loan. She said she'd pay it back regardless in installments starting that month, and she did every single month like clockwork, small deposits into my account with no note attached, which somehow felt more honest than if she'd written an apology with every payment. We are not close now, not in the way people mean when they talk about sisters who talk every day. But we talk. Milo has met his cousins twice this year, more than the previous 4 years combined. Denise sent me, unprompted, about 6 months after that storage unit day, a box of additional photographs she found going through some of our mother's remaining papers, photographs I'd genuinely never seen, including one from that coastal trip when I was 11, the 2 of us standing ankle-deep in the surf, my mother's arms around both of us at once, nobody's favorite in that particular frame, just 3 people who loved each other, captured before things got complicated. I keep that photo on my desk now, next to the baby book and the folded note I found in the bottom of that box. Some mornings I look at it before I start work and I think about how close I came to never finding any of it, how easily 18 months could have become 5 years, could have become forever if Arthur hadn't made that one phone call, if my mother hadn't written that clause into her will with such specific deliberate care. She knew somehow near the end that the truth needed a door left open for it, even if she couldn't walk through it herself. She built that door out of a storage unit and a legal clause and a folded piece of paper tucked at the bottom of a box, and she trusted that if I loved her enough, and if I was patient enough, I would eventually find my way to it. I did. It took longer than it should have, and it cost more than it should have, but I found it. And in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not revenge, not the satisfaction of catching someone in a lie, though I won't pretend that didn't feel like something when it happened. It's about the quiet, patient work of a mother who couldn't fix what she'd broken while she was alive, so she left the tools for someone else to fix it after she was gone. It's about a sister who mistook control for love and learned, slowly and imperfectly, that the two are not the same thing. And it's about me standing in a storage unit off a 2-lane highway, finally holding the pieces of my own childhood in my own 2 hands, understanding at last that I had never been the distant one. I had simply been the one nobody told the truth to. I know it now, and no one can take that from me again.